Captain Babu, please may I give my personal welcome to you for this evening's talk. We're really delighted and happy that we have like-minded colleagues joining us today, the CSMVS, the chairman and trustees, and the Director General, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, all the members of the Maritime Museum Society of Bombay, members of the Bombay Local History Society, their executive committees, their chairpersons, and on my own behalf, a very warm welcome to you to address us today. At the outset, I'd like to thank Sonavi Desai of Indus, who was your publisher, when I contacted her when we read about this book. And she was so gracious and she said, yes, we would love to do it. And she put you and me in touch with each other. I'm sure you had a lot of other people inviting you as well. And I was really delighted and privileged to be included in the actual book launch, where so many high-ranking officials of the Indian Navy, the Mazagon Docks, the Bombay Port Trust, the Bombay University were present to release the book. So thank you so very much on behalf of all of us for being here with us this evening. We're really looking forward to Mazagon, my own Mazagon. I confess I have been quick to go out and get your book, and I'm enjoying going through it, and it is a fund of information. I will just talk about it very briefly, but first I would like to introduce you to our audience this evening. Captain Ramesh Babu has just recently, 10 days ago, retired after serving in the Indian Navy for 25 years and Mazagon Dock for almost 15 years. Most of his professional life was spent in Mumbai, where he lived with his family for almost 30 years. Though an engineer by profession, he has a passion for history and has conducted regular heritage walks in Mumbai and in Calicut, where his aunt is based and where he does spend a lot of time, and where he also worked for 5 years. He edited a coffee table book on the history of Mazagon Dock in 2010 and wrote a book for the Navy on the HMS Trincomalee in 2017. Now that ship has a history of its own, and we'd like to hear more about it from you and how she sits on the water at Hartlepool. He's also written a book which is called After You, Sir, an anthology of school stories. His book on the medieval port of Calicut, titled Calicut Heritage Trails, was published by DC Books and released at the Kerala Literature Festival last year in 2020. My Own Mazagon is really a parting gift of Captain Babu to Mumbai as he leaves the city to settle down in his village in Kerala, and I hope I get the name right, Captain Babu, Tiruvalla, which is about 100 kilometers south of Cochin. Correct me if I'm wrong, Data. But more magnanimous than ever, the royalty from the book will be used to support Mumbai's slum children through the Oscar Foundation. Do get this book, ladies and gentlemen. It's a wonderful study on a small part of Bombay, a thriving part of Bombay, which we today call Majgam or Mazagon. It is really my own village. Just a few words about the book. Mazagon was one of the richest islands in Bombay Archipelago under the Portuguese and the early days of British rule. It remained an island fort, a dock, and even a gunpowder factory. Over the years, like the other islands, Mazagon too got merged into a single entity, which we now refer to as Bombay and now as Mumbai. But that did not diminish the importance of this precinct, which stayed on as a sought-after suburb of British Bombay. It's hard to imagine that Mazagon hosted fruit orchards And mangoes were grown for the Mughals. It got attacked by the Sidis. It really has a history of its own. It is from here that steamers sailed with cotton and opium, and the lady love of a romantic novelist eloped with a seafarer. It is here that majestic mansions, posh hotels, hanging gardens all came up in this gaothan that we know, East Indian gaothan that we know of today as Mazagon. Christian missionaries set up churches and schools, and a Nawab built a mosque and a tank. Portuguese seafarers bringing their staple food of bread, dock workers, Chinese temples, Pasi Agyaris, darghas came up. It is here also that the Aga Khan, Rattanbai, Jinnah, and Meena Kumari were laid to rest. It's quite interesting to see the index of this book. There's a Daru Khanawala, a marble mausoleum, railways, trams, flowers of Bombay, and I was quite intrigued by one chapter that he calls the Tragedy Queen. So I cheated and I skipped to 118 and I said, who is this lady? So he's already introduced us to Eliza and Rati. And this is her story, he says. Master Ali Box and Kamini were lured to Bombay by the silver screen. Who wasn't? Both of them were stage artists in Meerut. Ali Baks was a Sunni Muslim who came from Bhera, now in Punjab province of Pakistan, and he was a proficient in acting and music. It's quite an intriguing tale. Please do read about this tragedy queen of the Indian cinema and all the other chapters as they unfold from this wonderful publication. Very in-depth research, which I congratulate you personally, wholeheartedly. Many things have fallen by the wayside, but Captain Babu has been a real chronicler of this precinct. And whereas we all talk about the fort and its surroundings, he has really taken to heart, to mind, and to spirit the place that he has lived in and worked in for so many decades. This has really been a rediscovery, even for someone like me, who claims to know her Bombay quite well, of the lost history of Mazagon. And he really has, I congratulate you, and I don't want to say anything more, and I do not want to stand between you and the audience. I thank the publisher. I thank your family for probably giving you hours and hours and hours to roam about this area on foot and with your trusted driver as you went to look up little nuggets. So thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I say this at every event, that I would be failing in my duty if I didn't thank my technical team, so ably led by Professor Jason Johns, Aishwarya, Mrinalini, Sanjana, and Yashraj. It's been a challenging time, but we've come through it quite well, I feel. And thank you so much, tech team, for always being with us. And last but not the least, I thank my elected EC committee, my managing committee at the Museum Society of Bombay, for standing behind us, standing behind each other for every single event that we organize. Thank you so much. And technical team, now I hand you over to Captain Babu. Thank you very, very much. Looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not very sure if I really deserved all these accolades. It was just a labor of love for me. And put it very, very bluntly, my situation right now is quite like that of Mazagon in front of South Bombay, you know. I can see the who is who of Bombay here. I can see the icons of the city here. I can see the conservators of Mumbai's heritage here. I can see academicians here. I can see very senior colleagues of mine here. I can see my friends here. I can see my classmates here. I can see friends who joined in from the US and Europe. So it's a very humbling experience for me to be here right today in front of all of you all. And let me start by thanking my publisher and the entire team that made my own Mazagon, my team of map makers, my team of sketching artists. Incidentally, the map maker and the boys and the girls who've done the sketches are all architects who have never visited Mazagon. Uh, and my editor, my proofreaders, the book designer. So the first word of thanks should go to all of them. I have to also thank uh, the wonderful people of Mazagon who took me around, who welcomed me, the local historians here, uh, heritage buffs here who really, really guided me. So I have to thank each one of them for making this book possible. If you could just share my screen, my PPT, I'll straight away go into the presentation now. Checking. So let's start with the mangoes. You know, the mango season in Mumbai is like the Ganesh Utsav. It is more religious than anything else. Mango seems to be uh, kind of a religious attribute to the city. Mumbai's mangoes are so very, very famous, isn't it? When we see the airport in the season, you see each and every one carrying a little box of mangoes. But these mangoes they don't belong to Mazagon or they don't belong to Bombay. And they are not the best mangoes that grew here. To find out which are the best mangoes that grew here, we will have to look at a poem by Thomas More in 1817, where he talks of Lala Rook. Lala Rook is actually a maiden with tulip cheeks. She's Aurangzeb's daughter, who is taking a voyage, overland voyage to Kashmir from Delhi or Agra, and getting married in Kashmir and further going on to Central Asia with her bridegroom. So during this journey, those days they did not have mobile phones to while away their time. So there would be a person who would kind of keep narrating things to her to update her of what's happening and also to keep her entertained. So this person who is keeping her entertained laments of the lack of mangoes in the Mughal court because couriers who are stationed between Mazagon and the Mughal court in Agra or Delhi have failed to deliver the mangoes this season. This is what Thomas More says in his poem that he wrote in 1870. So where did these mangoes come from in Mazagon? Mazagon actually grew the best mangoes in the country. I've dug out several records which show that the Mazagon mangoes are much, much better than the Alfonso mangoes. Mazagon was that place which grew the best mangoes in the country. Mughal emperor had a garrison standing by here to protect the special orchard of mangoes in Mazagon. Later on, when the British came in, there was a special tree, which was called the governor's mango tree, which was in Mazagon. So that's the kind of mangoes that grew here. So probably the natural heritage of Mazagon came from this delicious mangoes. And here is a sketch that is there in there is a painting that is reproduced in the book by Rizma. But the original painting is a 1768 painting by William Hooker. And it figures in Oriental Memoirs by famous James Forbes. He wrote that in 1815. Now, so the little tiny place which grew these mangoes that were, serving the royal palate came from this small little island, which even today measures just a little more than 3 square miles. It was one of the 7 islands of the archipelago and part of Aparanta, Heptanasia. I don't have to tell a Bombay audience about, the evolution of Mazagon or Bombay and the empires that ruled over it. But the name is very important. It was called Matsyagrama in Sanskrit, which means a place which was plenty with fish. It was also called Mahishi Grama, incidentally, because there were water buffaloes here. Mahishi is a buffalo. Uh, it also had one interpretation which said that it was in the center of things. Probably it had so much of a significance that it meant the central courtyard. So there is an interpretation of a name like that. The Portuguese claim that they gave the name. However, all of us should like to believe that it comes from Mazagon, my own village. That's what the native Kolis call this place. And the name comes from Mazagon, or my own village, which is the name that the native Kolis call this place. And they continue to call it that. As Feroza Ma'am just said, they like to still call it as Majgaon, comes from Mazagon. The natives, as I just said, Kolis were the predominant community here. They were fishing. Bandaris were into toddy tapping. The Bhat Agris were into growing paddy. The Bhat Agris were growing paddy. The Bhajipala Agris were growing vegetables. The Meat Agris were, of course, panning salt in the marshy areas around the island. Then, like the rest of the city, starting with Basin, Mazagon also comes under the Portuguese, and it was under the Portuguese from 1534 to 1665. Now you see the lease rent this is how the Portuguese spelt Mazagon. So just see the lease rent that this island earned them. In 1536, it was 8,500 fidias. 1543, it goes up to 15,000. These were copper coins, and in 1544, they become silver coins, 510, and in 1547, 550 silver pardoas. They had an independent manor house here, and there was a lord of the Mazagon manor, who's Antonio Pessoa, from 1548 to 1571. Antonio Pessoa is a very interesting character because he was a captain of the army and the navy, because he fought many battles around the archipelago for the Portuguese. He also hosted the Nair king from Malabar, who came to be converted to Christianity in Goa. So, in thanksgiving to all his contributions to, spreading their religion and also protecting their military interests, the Mazagon manor was handed over to him, and he became the first lord of the Mazagon manor. He had, as I said, his own manor house, and you see the extent of this island. It did not only consist of this little island, it had a part of Varli, it had Butcher Island, and 5 villages of Basai. His successors lived in Dilemma Street, which is still called the Dilemma Street. Now, we all know of the famous dowry deed, and Mazagon was also annexed, though it was not part of the original package. But then, when the British annexed this island, it was earning 9,300 zeraphins against 6,344 of the larger Bombay, and 4,797 of the Mahim Island. So it's a very, very clear thing that right from the beginning, under the Portuguese days and in the early British days, Mazagon was that richest island, which earned them the highest revenue. This is how Mazagon would have looked in the early days of British. There would have been smaller vessels coming in here. Hills and their spurs would have been jetting into the sea with paddy fields and marshlands in between. There would be an odd bungalow here, there could even be a factory, and there were plenty of palm trees that the Bandaris tapped. So this little island, which, as I said, measures a little over 3 square miles, was predominant township through the 17th, 18th, and early part of the 19th centuries, and it had all the wherewithals of a predominant town. It had a dock, it had a harbor, uh, it had a fort, uh, it had churches, it had schools, um, it had a gunpowder factory. Everything that was required for a very self-contained colonial township was available here in Moscow. However, over a period of time, she lost her importance as that H-shaped island uh, got its castle and its fort, and became that predominant entity that we now call as South Bombay, encompassing the whole of Bombay, which led to the other islands being ignored. There were reasons other than that political and strategic reason. The filling up of the land of the marshy areas, the water that surrounded these islands also led to them losing their identity. Mazagon lost its identity, and over the period of time, it became just one of those suburbs of South Bombay, teeming with people, and all the big entities of Mazagon went away to other uh, more attractive places like the Malabar Hill. So that lost identity had to be resurrected. And it was destined on me to resurrect that lost identity because I decided to make a parting gift to the city where I have, as Firoza ma'am said, worked and lived for almost 30 years. So I had to make a parting gift to the city, and given my background of you know, doing heritage walks and reading up a bit of history, I said that it had to be a book on history of Bombay. I first toyed with the idea of writing a book on the history of South Bombay, but then there are plenty of books on it, and I said this would be just one more book. But while I was researching for that book, I found flashes of Mazagon appearing here, there, here, there, here, there. So I picked up the references, and fortunately, the internet helped. A lot of archives are available online these days, and there are books available in archives, mainly the 19th century, even some 18th century books, and definitely the first part of the 20th century, which came in handy. And I initially, when we talked to Sunavi of Indosource and my map maker Chinnu, he said, okay, we could be able to put together a book of about 100 pages or so. Then once research started, Mazagon really came alive in front of you, like this huge hill that is standing behind that ship. Mazagon just presented itself. And at one point, we had to say, now let's stop it. So these 296 pages that have come into this book just presented itself. That rich is the history of this place. And today we have it in the form of a book. And I wish that this humble effort of ours actually inspires historians and chroniclers to write about the lost history of the other islands of Bombay. Mahim, for example, Vasai. All these islands have had their own fantastic history. So I wish they also come alive. So let's start with this hill that we just talked about, the Mazagon Hill. It, like any waterfront hill, was a hill with a fort. All of us are aware that Bombay had two lines of hills. The one on the west, starting with Malabar Hill and going all the way down to Parli Hill and further up. And here it started with the Navroji Hill and came to the Dongri Hill, Navroji Hill, Mazagon Hill. Like that, it went along the eastern coastline. Fortunately, it is only the Mazagon Hill that is still standing. And unfortunately, we have lost all the other hills, most of the other hills. And why is this hill standing? Basically because of a water shortage that came here in the 1840s and 1850s, for which they had to find solutions. So dams were built in Bihar and Powai and other areas, and water was pumped in, and they had to be stored at elevated places underground. The famous hanging gardens in Malabar Hill came up that way, and the not so famous hanging garden in Mazagon also came up that way atop the Bandarwada Hill. And that hill has stayed thanks to the water. And spurs of that hill mostly have been really pulled down. One of the spur towards the north, towards the east and north, had a fort, which, as Firoza ma'am said, was attacked by the Sidis on behalf of the Mughals. And that attack was actually put down by a Parsi Patel, who happened to be the son of the first known Parsi settler in Bombay. It had a haunted house. This is the tomb of the lady who haunts the Mazagon Hill. The Belvedere house stayed atop, was built atop the Mazagon Hill. There lived a lady, Eliza Draper, married to Mr. Draper, who was a dry, drab East India Company official, could not really cope with the romanticism and the public school ethos of Eliza Draper, who, though born in Malabar, was educated in a public school in England. She carried a certain value system which was not matching with the purely commercial and administrative interests of a British East India Company bureaucrat. Also had his own affairs with women, both European and native, which was disgusting for Eliza. She got a chance to travel abroad, travel back to England to put her children in school. There she falls in love with a novelist, a romantic novelist. That story is extremely interesting, though tragic. Finally elopes from here and dies to have this tomb erected in the United Kingdom. Her spirit is supposed to have haunted the Belvedere house, which stayed atop the Mazagon Hill. We talked about the hanging garden, thanks to which that hill is still standing. The hill, as I said, had spurs which went mainly north-south and some even to the west. One of those spurs ended in the Godabdev rock. Now, this Godabdev rock is a remnant of the original volcanic formation that made up Bombay and the areas around here. So Mazagon is one place where a volcanic rock is worshipped as God. What better way of worshipping nature? It's a very simple, rundown kind of an area where this temple exists opposite the railway station. And many people are not even aware that there is a temple like this where a volcanic rock becomes God. This was part of that Mazagon Hill, and there were. This is one of the Koli shrines in Bombay, and Mazagon also was that chosen place to set up more temples. And as the Portuguese and the British came, more churches, Parsis came, Agaris, as the Muslims came, mosques and darghas. So we'll just quickly run through those religious structures also. This is one of them, a very famous church in Bombay. We are all aware of this. We see it almost every day as we cross the Baikla area. This is the Gloria Church. Standing just behind is the Antonio's High School, Anzas. I'm sure there are students of Anzas, here, ex-students of Anzas in this very session. The Gloria Church was not originally built here. It was built along the Mazagon waterfront. And it was one of those first three Portuguese churches that came up in Bombay, the other two being in Dadar and Mahi. So one of the first Portuguese churches, the Gloria Church, was built along the Mazagon waterfront. It used to stand where the Bombay Port Trust colony is there now. That school, the Antonio School, came up as a school first, teaching in Portuguese, then Latin, then English. So the school that you see behind the church was also set up in Mazagon, very close to the original Gloria Church, which came up sometime in 1632. Actually, there was a family chapel of the feudal lords of the Portuguese lords of Mazagon standing there, and it is in that place that the Gloria Church later came up. The Rosary Church came up almost like a rebel church because the local converts had a problem with, the Catholics who were praying at the Gloria Church, and British allowed the locals to build a church, and that became the Rosary Church. The Rosary Church continues to stand at the original place where it was built, but Gloria Church has been shifted from its original location near the waterfront to where we see it today, along the Victoria Road or the Sun South Amali Road. St. Anne's came up thanks to Rose Nesbitt, an Armenian lady who stayed in Mazagon, donated a piece of her land. Actually, she set up a family chapel in her own property, and her successors later handed over that property to set up St. Anne's Church. 1787, it started as a chapel, and in 1881, it converted to the St. Anne's Church that we see today. St. Peter's, another church which started close to the waterline, not very far from the Dockyard Road railway station in 1858, and later relocated to its present location on top of, the Dockyard Road. When we go up the Dockyard Road, you see the St. Peter's Church and the St. Peter's School. Incidentally, the dome of the St. Peter's Church was built to resemble the St. Peter's Cathedral. However, given the local climatic conditions, that became a disaster. The dome still stands, but every monsoon, right from those days when it was first built, it is quite a tough task for them to maintain. These are the famous churches of Mazagon. Incidentally, in the 1855 map, we also located another church, which has vanished without a trace. I have mentioned it in the book, the location of the church. However, we don't have much of history of that church. So there were many churches and places of worship set up for the Christians in Mazagon. Within this church, all these churches, there is a lot of history preserved. I'll just show you one piece that we discovered during our research. Coincidentally, while I was making the manuscript, the Rosary Church was going through a renovation. Father Nigel, who is a very, very concerned citizen of Bombay, who likes to preserve the history of and heritage of the city, along with this team, were renovating the church, and they discovered 6 graves. We knew that that area where Rosary Church stands was originally a graveyard, but we did not know that there were people buried under the floor of the church. So these must have been very predominant, well-to-do people, and the 6 graves were discovered from under the floor of the church, and one which is not under the benches has been preserved by Father Nigel and his team very, very tastefully. You see, this is a grave of Senorita Rosa Nesbita. She's not the same Rosa Nesbita of Armenian origin that I said. She is a Portuguese lady who died on 8th April 1795. So there is a 1795 grave. So if you look around, I'm sure there would be more graves, old graves still lying buried under Mazagon. Similarly, there are a number of little structures, little artifacts which are there in all these churches, which talk about Portuguese and British days in the city. Mosques. the Moti Masjid Mosque, Ayaz Nawab Masjid, the Jamali Hall, the Nariyal Wadi Masjid. We will talk about Ayaz Nawab Mosque a little later. The Moti Masjid is interesting. All of us who cross Baikala must be seeing these two structures standing next to each other, right? There is a mosque and a very old Hanuman Mandir sharing the same building. Uh, it's not that there was always complete harmony there. There were hiccups, there were issues, but for the last many years, they have been coexisting, almost standing shoulder to shoulder and representing communal harmony to such an extent that whenever recent riots have occurred in Bombay, this has been one of the safest places because uh, if there's a problem with the mosque, the Hanuman Mandir people protect it. And if there's a problem with the Hanuman Mandir, the Moti Masjid people. This is a very good symbol of communal harmony, which is standing as two very old religious structures in Bombay. And one of them is a mosque, the other is a Hanuman Mandir. The Jamali Hall is on the Sabdamali Mark and the Nariyal Wadi Masjid. The Nariyal Wadi area was essentially a large tract of land which was owned by a Parsi gentleman who was into the business of coconuts. And that area has become now a set of graveyards. We'll talk about it later. And one of the masjids which stand there is a very old masjid. There are other older masjids, but compared to churches, the masjids and the darghas are more recent. Hindu temples. We just saw the Godabdev temple. The Mankeshwar temple on the PWL road is another very old temple. Again, you don't see much of it, but when you go inside in the mess of this kind of temporary constructions and riffraffs all around, if you look carefully, you will see very ancient idols like this particular plaque. It's written in a book which is more than 100 years old, that this plaque has Kannada engravings, and even today a bit of it is there, and most of it is gone. But the Mankeshwar temple, which is supposed to be a Swayambhu temple, has been there for centuries. The Gaodevi, Godabdev, we talked about Godabdev. The Gaodevi temple that you see when you go on the railway line atop the Mazagon hill is a more recent temple. It may be a little more than 100 years old. Then there are a number of Hanuman temples in Mazagon. All of us know that Hanuman is endowed with this power to protect us against diseases and ailments. Given the bouts of plague and cholera and other pandemics in the city, Hanuman would have been sought after God here. And like most parts of Maharashtra, Mazagon also has its share of Hanuman temple. Jain temples. The Motisha Jain temple on the Love Lane is very popular. It's a very well-built marble temple. And the Jains who stay around there look after it very well. And there are other temples, lesser known temples like the Chaitya temple, which is on the Mazagon Road. And in the Sutargali area, which is the Carpenter Lane, there is an equally old Jain temple because the Sutars or the carpenters who worked in the docks and set up this Carpenter Lane were Jains. So there is a Jain temple. There are other smaller Jain temples all over the place. Then that lone Chinese temple dedicated to war god, built in the 1920, continues to stand here, though all the Chinese residents, but for 3 families, have gone away. Now, people do say that the Chinese came to Mazagon as dock workers in the 1920s. That's based on the date of construction of this temple and the CUQ buildings, which are used for housing around the temple. But I was able to discover a newspaper article of 1866 in the Times of India, which said that Singapore a ship that was being built here in Mazagon dock. The upholstery of that ship was done by Chinese workers. And there were Chinese here in Bombay. We know that they were there in the tea factories in Powai, and most of them were Cantonese. Canton was a place where our ships from here sailed with mainly opium. So it was but natural that Cantonese people came here, and since they were anyway, on the waterfront, they found it very easy to get jobs here in the dock. Later, they became mill hands also. But there was a predominant Chinese community that stayed close to Mazagon dock, and they celebrated all the Chinese festivals around this temple. The temple is still very, very well kept, and it's a must visit temple for all of us who love the city, because this is still that only one standing Chinese temple in Bombay. It is open normally from 10 to 5. If there's a problem, the family that maintains the temple just leaves one floor down. You can always knock the door and visit the temple. Parsi Agaris. Incidentally, now there are two Agaris standing in Moscow, but those two were not the first Agari. The first Agari was built in 1822. That is the Narilwala Agari, which was later shifted to Dada. Then the Framji Nasarwanji Patel Agari was built in 1845, and the Anjuman Batliwala Agari was built in 1907. Thanks to shipbuilding, a large number of Parsi master builders from the Wadia family came here, and along with them came a lot of other Parsi gentlemen who were into various other businesses, including trading in cotton, making items for the ships built here. They were agents of the British, and they made a substantial population in Moscow, and they had to have their places of worship, and that's how these three Agaris came up. Even today, there are very, very identifiable Parsi settlements in Moscow, though most of them are not having any occupants, because a large number of Parsis who lived in Moscow have left Moscow. As I said, one of the places that they went to was Malabar Hill, and vacating the mansions that they built here in Moscow. There are still colonies here. For example, in the extremity of Moscow, along the Victoria Road, along the Sant Savdamali Road, we have the two Parsi colonies, which is still fully occupied. But within the interiors of Moscow, there are very few Parsis who are now living. But the Agaris are there, and honestly, the priests in the Agari, they told me that they are struggling because they don't have that kind of local patronage. So these Agaris will have to be, looked after well, and people are doing their best, but the patronage that they deserve is not there right now. Then, as I said, there was a gunpowder factory here. We all know of the gunpowder road. That Moscow has a gunpowder road. It's a very famous address in Moscow. The road that comes from the Moscow Circle all the way to the waterfront is called the gunpowder road. And that's because there was a gunpowder works that was set up here in 1769. The reason to shift the gunpowder works from within the fort to Moscow is very interesting, because by then Moscow had already become a far-flung area. It was not part of the fort. It was not the epicenter of Bombay. So it was a far-flung area, and it was safe to relocate an explosive enterprise like the gunpowder works to Moscow. And the reasons are for shifting the gunpowder works to Moscow are given in the book. Very, very interesting reasons, explosive reasons. Finally, the Moscow gunpowder works had its own share of explosions, and it was found too risky to have it here, and it was shifted to Khadki. All of us know that Khadki became a cantonment centered around the ammunition. So once a deal was struck with the Peshwas, and the hill highway was built, and later the railway lines were built. It was easy to access the Ghats, up the Ghats, access Pune, and Khadki was the chosen place to shift the gunpowder works from Mazagon. But the name Gunpowder Road stays, and a lesser known fact is that the street that goes by the side of Mazagon Dock all the way to railroad station is actually called the Magazine Street. That's because they are the gunpowder magazine. So if this was a predominant place and there were well-to-do people here, they had to have their mansions, and Mazagon had its own share of mansions. There was a Mazagon castle, which was built by Yamsaji Jijiboy's family. There was a mansion built by David Sasso. There was can't be really called a mansion, but a fairly large cottage built by Royton Prem. So all the well-known figures that built Bombay had their mansions here. So did the British. Some of these mansions were occupied by high-ranking officials of British East India Company and later the British presidency. And many of these mansions were, standing for a long, long time. Even after I came to Mazagon about 15 years back, as I walked down the Nesbitt Road, we used to see these mansions. Unfortunately, most of them have been pulled down now, and skyscrapers of the neo age are coming up there. It's a sad plight to see these mansions really, really going down, and some of the cottages, I won't like to call them mansions, some of the cottages that remain are also in a very, very dilapidated state. And very soon, builders lobby is going to take over these. But Mazagon had its share of. As I said, once Malabar Hill was established and the Baikala area was dried up, and there was now a road built connecting Mazagon to Malabar Hill. The people started shifting away from here to a more sought after places in Malabar Hill. That's how Mazagon lost its mansions. There were cottages, as I said. This is a view of a Mazagon street in the middle of the 19th century. You can see this beautiful cottage. It's like walking anywhere in one of the European villages. See the nice fencing and the veranda. Many of these cottages were inspired by Kohli constructions, which had these verandas around, open verandas, which were used for mending their nets and so on. Then Mazagon Dock, the longest standing enterprise of Mazagon, the longest standing industry of Bombay, organized industry of Bombay. There is a letter of 1669 or 1670 by Gerald Anger, where he says, in his plan to develop Bombay as the urbus prime, as the primary city, he says, he talks about, harboring ships in Bombay, and he specifically says, ships up to 200 tons can be anchored and pulled ashore and repaired in Mazagon. So Mazagon as a safe haven for ships mentioned as early as 1669-70. It obviously was a waterfront. The coolies were fishing around here every day. They were catching bombills and black pomfrets and all sort after fish. And the British, once they came in, realized that the safety of the hills around provided a good enough harbor. Or not very deep, and that's why the tonnage was kept to 200 tons. Over the centuries, it has grown, and we got records to show that in 1774, mud flat was built here to pull up ships and do work on the bottom. The Mazagon Dock still uses it as one of their dry docks. So from 1774, organized shipbuilding has been going on here. Later on, the P&O took over part of the Mazagon dock, which we now call as the North Yard, and British India Steam Navigation Company took over the South Yard, um, and the area in between had a road which led to the Mazagon Pier. So it was a very beautiful waterfront location where ships were harboring and ships were ships were being built and ships were being repaired, and it was also a place from where you could embark on a sea voyage. So the Mazagon waterfront was a very, very active waterfront with its own um, anchoring, its own repairing, and its own shipbuilding facility. Numerous ships have been built here, uh, though not as celebrated as the warships built in Bombay dock, which had higher depths. Mazagon has its own share of ships that were built, and some of them have done fairly well. The cover of the book actually shows the brig Tigris, which was built which was launched in 1820. Brig is a brigantine which had about 10 to 12 guns and mainly protected trade along the shore. Uh, Thanks to the work that I did for the coffee table book on Mazagon, I was able to write a fairly detailed chapter in the book on Mazagon docks and bring out certain things which I could not cover in that coffee table book. And consistency of the dock still shows. The South Yard under the BISN did brisk business. They were competing with each other, BISN and P&O. And later on, when Scindia Steam Navigation Company came, that came in between the two, South Yard and the North Yard. And there was a phase when, the yard was not doing very well. So they built some extraordinary things like the bronze equestrian statue of Shivaji standing in the Sri Shivaji Memorial School in Pune, the first equestrian statue of Shivaji. The church bell in Rosary Church, built in cast in 1920. So the dock was doing, all kinds of jobs. And later on, in the 1950s, when Mahindras and Mohammed, now called Mahindra and Mahindra, started their Jeep business, they used to assemble Jeep in the Mazagon docks. And in 1960, when India started its drive to build public sector enterprises, Mazagon dock became a public sector shipyard and continues to build destroyers, frigates, and submarines here. So this yard has been doing that first organized business of Bombay for so many centuries and continues to do so. So if it was a waterfront, you can see the waterfront here. You can see the waterfront here. It is a Getty image. It's courtesy Getty Images. You can see the waterfront ships anchored here. You can see the pier that goes down like that. This is a pier. This is the Mazagon pier. This is the Mazagon pier. Okay, you can see the Mazagon docks. You can even see the Kasara Basin. You can see a part of the foundry where that famous Shivaji statue was cast. You can see some improvised cranes. You can see part of the shipyard's works here, the office and design department and all that. And you can also see the P&O terrace, which is still there, occupied by executives of Mazagon dock. So this is where the P&O executives live. So if it was such a famous waterfront and it was a place to anchor and embark and disembark ships, it had to have its hotels. This here was a very famous hotel. This here was a very famous hotel. So Mazagon had a number of hotels, posh hotels in Bombay, and some of the earliest hotels like Hope Hall and all that were set up here. This is a picture taken from the Mazagon. You can see toddy being collected here, and you can see an earlier version of the Rosary Church on. This place is lying empty. We may get to talk about it time permitting. Sorry, I went back. Yeah. So there were churches, there were temples, there were mosques, there was a dock, there were hotels, and people were staying in mansions and cottages. So the children had to study, and some of the best schools in Bombay came up in St. Mary's in the 1860s, then the Saint Isabel, uh, Saint Peter's, Anza. These were all set up by Christian missionaries. So was the Deaf and Mute Institute, which was the first such institute in India, a school for hearing impaired children, which still runs. This is the St. Mary's School, which was built in the same pattern as the Eton Public School. And we know the famous alumni of the school, including Mr. Subin Mehta, who will graciously given a few words in the book. Number of luminaries have been from the school. Currently, we have Asim Premji. We also have Samir Somaya, who runs Kitab Khana for us. So this school has been serving the academic needs of Bombay for right from 1864. We also have Eli Kaduri, which was actually a school which was set up by the Bene Israeli community. Bene Israeli community came here thanks to the opportunities available in Bombay from their Ratnagiri areas, and set up a fairly large community in Mazagon in an area which is still called Israel Chowk. And they had to have a school. And in 1875, they started a school which was relocated in Mazagon in 1899. That school is still running, though the last Jewish student left in 2007. Interestingly, while it was teaching Jewish kids predominantly, and they were being taught in Hebrew, Marathi was the medium of the school, because they felt that they should mingle. The Bene Israelis have always mingled with the local population. So the Marathi was the medium of the school, though the Jewish students were taught in Hebrew. Then there were all other kinds of amenities like hospitals, old age homes, orphanages, affordable housing. We talked about Rustenbag and Dierbach. They were affordable housing. There was a big chawls that came up here, again, affordable housing. This is the Masina Hospital. This is the Sansui building. This is the bungalow set up by David Sassoon. And it was gifted to, at a very low price, to the doctor who actually, operated David Sassoon's painful hernia. So this is David Sassoon's mansion, which is now functioning as the Masina Hospital. The irony of this slide is that it shows the Baikla police station. That's because Mazagon doesn't have its own police station. Mazagon is policed by the Baikla police station and Sivri police station. So if somebody has to go for a passport verification from Mazagon, he has to either go to Sivri if he's living along the waterfront, or if he's on up the hill, he has to go to Baikla. The Sivri police outpost in front of Mazagon Dock was, of course, set up for the Mazagon Dock. And it was also to ensure safety of the people who celebrated the Chinese New Year here. When I say all this, I have to very proudly say that Mazagon, in fact, had one of the first police stations with an attached court in Bombay. These police stations in Baikla came up, I think, in 1940s. All these police stations in the 1920s and 40s, they all came up. But well before that, there was a police office in Mazagon, and it had an attached court. It really, really looked after all the crimes committed in most parts of the city, because the police stations that we know of today were not existing. And since Mazagon was that sort of a place, and Mazagon was that place where a lot of people were living, one of the first police stations and courts came up here in Mazagon. There's an entire chapter on policing, a very interesting chapter where one has been able to really dig out certain crimes that were handled by the Mazagon police station and the Mazagon court, some interesting transactions between the court officials of Mazagon and the Bombay High Court, and also about a gallows which stood near the Mazagon court. Even today, the old timers in Mazagon, including Mr. Rafiq Baghdadi, who is the local historian of Mazagon, says that as children, they were really afraid of walking that way to school because they knew that there was a gallows standing there on which people used to be hanged. Uh, there's a very old court case involving Aga Khan, where it is mentioned that people who were creating some trouble in other parts of Bombay, claiming to be representing the Aga Khan, were hanged in the Mazagon gallows. So there was a functioning gallows here in Mazagon. Then, as was mentioned, Mazagon had its own village settlement, a gaothan, um, which was occupied by East Indians and continues to be occupied by East Indians. How the East Indians came here, how the Kolis were converted, why East Indians had to come here from places as far as Vasai and all those areas, Virar and Vasai and all these areas, and to work in the docks and the mills. And since there were many creeks and there were no train running, they decided to settle down here. And they found East Indians already here, and together they started the settlement called Matarpakadi. Matarpakadi is struggling. Matarpakadi is struggling to retain its heritage. Almost on a weekly basis, Matarpakadi is losing some of these charming cottages. Though the precinct itself is declared as a Grade 3 heritage precinct, Rattanbai is losing its battle in preserving the heritage of the Gaothan and also the heritage of Mazagon. So this is a very interesting area with its own chapel and its own well and even its own mango tree, which they claim was part of the original carries the part of the original Mazagon mangoes DNA. This is a place where Mascuranas and Kaka Baptist, who were very predominant citizens involved in the freedom struggle, lived. And unfortunately, though Dr. Mascuranas' bungalow is still there, Kaka Baptist, Baptista's bungalow has been razed down, and there's a skyscraper coming up in that area. So I think it is around Matarpakadi that the heritage conservation of Mazagon should start. The people there are really, really concerned. They get orders from here, there, everywhere, saying that your buildings are unsafe, so they got to be pulled down. So the book actually urges the reader to participate in their desire to protect their Gauthan and also the rest of Mazagon. It's around Matarpakadi that the Kuts, the Goan Kuts, most of us are aware of the Goan Kuts, where Goan bachelors stayed naming each building after their village. So there are a number of Kuts which are there still around Matarpakadi. So if there were so many people living here, eventually all the transport systems had to come to Mazagon. So there were trams, Mazagon TT. You can see the route in this ticket. Starts in Sasundok, goes all over the place, and finally comes to Mazagon. Yeah. So Mazagon had its own tram terminus. The tram used to come and turn around and go. So Mazagon had a tram terminus. Mazagon later in the 1920s had the harbour line, and it is thanks to the hill and the tank under it that the railway line had to be elevated all the way from Sanders Road to Ray Road because the hill couldn't be really pulled down, and trim up the hill and have this elevated one of the first electric lines in the city, if not in the country. In the 1920s, there was an electric train flying here. So the harbour line finally got completely connected up to the main line once the Dockyard Road station was built in the 1920s. trams were there, trains were there, and so were tongas. The book covers a couple of incidents involving horse carriages. Mazagon had, important people living here, and they had to have their own horse carriages. It was like, let's say, the area in front of BT or the Flora Fountain area. Right? All these amenities were there, even in Moscow. Then the pao. Pao is a bread that was brought in here by the Portuguese sailors, and got patronized by the converted Christians, and slowly it went home. And it went home to be fermented, uh, not with yeast because they did not have yeast. So wheat got fermented with toddy, and Portuguese pao became the quintessential Bombay, uh, you know, culinary pleasure. If there's one food item that identifies itself with Bombay, that is a pao. Right? And like most of the other East Indian areas in the city, the PAV made its humble beginnings in Mazagon also. And for me, it was very, very interesting as I would take my morning walks to take in the fragrance of PAV from many bakeries, starting with the Mankeshwar bakery along the waterfront, going up the hill to the Philomena bakery and the bakeries on the Love Lane. So it was a pleasure actually taking in the fragrance of PAV. If there was pav, then bread had to come. Whips came in here. You all know Whips is one of the popular brands of bread in Bombay. Later on, when Britannia set up its first factory in Bombay, it came to Moscow. And that factory continues to exist near railroads. Many of these bakeries are very old, run by the third, fourth generation owners, and they are also continuing to run. And the breadwalas that go up and down the city, most of them carry pav and bread from Moscow. There were other amenities. Once the railway line came, in fact, the railway line came and sliced off a bit of Moscow. The JJ Hospital and that part of Moscow, on the other side of the Hancock Bridge, that got sliced off. Wadi Bandar got sliced off. Um, Part of Baikla got sliced off once the railway line came. And the first trains running across Mazagon as watched from the Mazagon court um, is narrated very well in the early railway chronicles. And these bridges, there were issues in building the bridges. The railway said it's not our responsibility to build the bridges. The municipality said it's not our responsibility. So the matter was finally amicably settled, and the three bridges in Moscow, the Olivan Bridge, the Hancock Bridge, and the Baikla Bridge, are as historic as any other railway bridge in the country, and Olivan Bridge is still preserved. Bridges came, roads came, streets came, sewage trains. There are still, the old wrought iron ventilation pipes standing in Mazagon over the drains laid by the British. Telephone poles. There are old Parsi doctors' houses where you still see unused telephone poles because they got their telephone connections on priority. Tanks, I talked about the underground tank on the Bandarwada Hill. There were other tanks also that were here in Moscow, a number of them. Ganga Baudi, for example. Then the mausoleum of the Aga Khan, uh, Aga Khan's journey to India, all the way from Iran through Afghanistan, participating in the first Afghan war, is a fascinating journey. And how he decided to settle here and then go back to Iran, and how he had to be sent to Calcutta, and how he came back, and how he got the patronage of the British, and how they even gave him a gun salute, and they called him His Highness. It's a very interesting story, and his mausoleum, almost shaped like the Taj Mahal, stands in Mazagon. So do a number of other darghas, including of peers who did not come to Mazagon at all. From this celebrated, mausoleum down to forgotten graves. Rattanbai Jinnah. We know her tragic story. And Meena Kumari, tragedy queen that Firoza ma'am was mentioning. Meena Kumari, the tragedy queen of Indian cinema, the all-time tragedy queen of Indian cinema, is laid to rest in Mazagon. Incidentally, these graveyards are belonging to different communities, predominantly Muslim communities, but in between there is also a Jewish cemetery, which is now maintained by a devout Muslim keeper. So there are a number of forgotten graves here. And to me, it was very touching to cover these tragedians of Mazagon, whether it was Meena Kumari, Rattanbai Jinnah, or Eliza Draper, who all loved and lost. It was a very touching story. Fortunately, we still have their memories here. And a bit of mystery. I just showed you that vacant land which was lying in that 1855 photograph next to the Mazagon dock. That was a marshland. Now there's a mall coming up there. And there's a market there which people now call as the Babu Genu market. We all know the story of Babu Genu, isn't it? How much did he contribute for our freedom struggle? The valiant act of standing in front of the truck, carrying imported cotton, imported fabric, and then getting run over because he stood his ground. That market was named after Babu Genu. But the market was, that marshland was originally converted to a market by a gentleman called Captain Henry, who was the superintendent of the Mazagon docks. And he called it the Pedder Market. And one day in the 1880s, when Henry and his wife were coming down in their carriage to the docks, the carriage kind of toppled and Captain Henry died on the spot. And in his memory, in one corner of the Pedder Market, they erected a fountain named the Henry Fountain. And like many of the missing fountains of Bombay, the Henry Fountain also went missing. So this was a mystery that one was wanting to resolve. And fortunately, thanks to Mr. Deepak Rao, the salute historian of Bombay, he told me this. He said, "Look, let us compare the description of the description of the Henry Fountain is very graphically given, and when we compare the description, we could establish with a certain extent of surety that this could be the tip of that Henry Fountain, which went missing from Pedder Market in front of Mazagon Dock. Right now, it is standing in a green patch, a small, tiny green patch near the Mazagon Castle bus stop of the hill. And the Nawab of Mazagon, who made a tank and a mosque. We still have the Nawab Tank Road here. When one went around asking for the Nawab Tank Road and the Nawab, they said, yeah, there's a road here, and there is a tank which was built by some Nawab, and there is a Nawab Ayas mosque. More than that, nobody knew anything. They said, yeah, possibly that Nawab was buried somewhere here. But then, luckily, I was able to discover a panorama, I think of the 1830s, where the residence of the Nawab is shown. And that is exactly where the mosque is standing, very close to it. And his name is given as Hayat Sahib. I suddenly remembered reading about Hayat Sahib somewhere and realized that I had read about him in the Malabar Manual while I was researching for my book on Calicut. Unfortunately, at that time, a blog by Maddie's Ramblings is a very interesting blog that all of us should read if you want to know what the history of Bombay, Calicut, and such other places. So, a blog in Maddie's Ramblings revealed that this Nawab Ayas and the Hayat Sahib were the same people. And I dug out my copy of Malabar Manual and found that this Nawab of Mazagon was born a Nair, Hindu Nair boy in the Tirakil kingdom of Kannur in Malabar, and was captured by Hyder Ali in one of the attacks, converted, and took a rather treacherous path of destiny to reach Mazagon, finally under British protection. And he set up a tank here. He set up a mosque here. The tank was existing. Even today, there are a couple of wells under this water spout. Now it is, of course, a playground, but there is water under this playground. And he also set up the mosque. So he has left his mark on the history of Mazagon. But people have forgotten about him. And I feel fortunate to have rediscovered this lost Nawab of Mazagon. So there are, little treasures all over the place. As you walk around, you will suddenly discover something somewhere. This cross is standing on the hospital lane next to the church street. Both of them branch off from the Dilemma Street. So as I said, Dilemma Street is the place where the Portuguese lord's family lived. And one of the streets that branched off from here to the Gloria Church was called the Church Street. That's no more existing because there's no church there anymore. The street is there, but the church is not there. Now, when the Gloria Church was shifted from its original location in the 1909, 1910 to its new location in Baikala, the cross remained here. But later in the 1920s, when the still standing Anderson House had to be built for, accommodating the port trust officials, this cross had to be uprooted. So the cross was uprooted from its original location near the original Gloria Church to be relocated at the corner of the hospital lane, which is very close to the church street. So some justice has been done where you can still walk the church street to, if not go to the church, to go and pray at this cross. And why hospital lane? Because there was a hospital there with a building now called the Bob Bungalow, used to be the hospital. And during the Second World War, a number of injured soldiers and sailors used to be brought in ships anchoring off Mazagon to be lifted and treated at the hospital. So there was a hospital here. There's a Nowland Street there, which has its own history. So you keep discovering all these kinds of gems of history all over the place. And my own Mazagon, as I said, has been an effort to trace these historic trails which throw up surprises all over Mazagon. And still more, many more are waiting to be discovered. And so are, structures like this and stories like this in all the other islands of Bombay. So while we have done enough justice to South Bombay, let's now start focusing on the other islands which made up the archipelago. I'm sure the doyens of Bombay's heritage who are participating in this session will take it up seriously, and one would be gratified in one's Kerala village, telling stories to one's mother and growing fruits and flowers that, yes, another book has come up on Mahim, or another book has come up on Varli, or another book has come up on Vasai. So that would be that would give a sense of gratification to the team that worked on this book. I thank Museum Society, the Maritime Museum Society, the Bombay Local History Society, and the museum itself for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much, and Jai.